Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Mark Holden never wanted a fight. Moving to Coastal Hills, California, he sought peace, away from city chaos. But when HOA President Samantha Reed illegally seized his land for her grand project, Mark had no choice but to fight back. What started as a property dispute soon unraveled a web of corruption, power, and revenge. Mark Holden had always valued his privacy. After years of working as an architect in the chaotic heart of Los Angeles, he had finally escaped to a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Coastal Hills, California. His property sat on the edge of the community, a beautiful two-story home surrounded by old oak trees, with a backyard that stretched toward a quiet, sloping hill. The biggest draw for Mark had been the lack of restrictions. Unlike the rest of the neighborhood, his land was not under the jurisdiction of the Coastal Hills Homeowners Association, HOA, an organization notorious for its rigid rules and overbearing president, Samantha Reed. To him, this place was a sanctuary, a haven from bureaucracy and endless regulations. He had no idea that his fight for peace was just beginning. One morning, Mark was jolted awake by the deafening roar of heavy machinery. At first, he thought it was roadwork or a neighbor's minor renovation. But when the unmistakable crash of a bulldozer echoed through his house, shaking the very walls, he threw on a hoodie, grabbed his phone, and stormed outside. His breath caught in his throat at the sight before him. A full-fledged construction site had erupted in the middle of his backyard. Workers in hard hats maneuvered a backhoe, ripping into the earth, while others set up stacks of steel beams and cement bags near what had once been his pristine lawn. A temporary chain-link fence had been installed overnight, blocking off a large portion of his land. At the center of it all, standing on the far side of the fence with a clipboard in hand, was none other than Samantha Reed herself. The elegant but iron-fisted woman, always dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting, surveyed the chaos with satisfaction. Mark's anger flared as he stormed toward her, dodging a worker who barely glanced up from his power drill. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying over the sound of machinery. Samantha turned to him with a smug smile, barely concealing her condescension. "Oh, good morning, Mark. I was hoping you'd come out so we could discuss this." She gestured vaguely toward the construction site, as if he were merely asking about a small landscaping project. Mark clenched his fists. "This is my property. Who gave you permission to build here?" Samantha let out a patronizing chuckle. "Well, technically, it's still yours. For now. But your land is in an unregulated part of the neighborhood, and we realized what a waste of space it was just sitting here. The HOA board voted to repurpose this area for a community recreational center and a new pool. It will benefit the entire neighborhood." Mark's stomach twisted in disbelief. "I don't give a damn what benefits the HOA. My land isn't part of your association. You can't just build on it." Samantha sighed as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "I understand your concern, but there's no need to be so emotional about this. We're improving the community, Mark. Besides, the paperwork is already moving forward to have your land incorporated into HOA jurisdiction. Once that happens, it'll officially fall under our authority." Mark took a step back, his pulse hammering. "That's not how this works. You can't just steal my property with some paperwork trick. This is illegal." She smirked. "Oh, it'll be legal soon enough. I have connections in the zoning department, and they agree that your land is best used for something everyone can enjoy. Look at it this way. You won't have to worry about maintenance anymore." Mark's hands trembled with barely contained rage. He had heard about HOA horror stories before. Neighbors fined for leaving their trash cans out too long. Residents forced to repaint their homes for the sake of uniformity. But this was beyond absurd. This was outright theft. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. There was no point in arguing with her. Samantha was too confident, too self-assured that her connections and power made her untouchable. But Mark wasn't the type to roll over. Without another word, he pulled out his phone and snapped photos of the construction, the fence, the bulldozer tearing through his land. He was going to stop this one way or another. Mark didn't waste a second. The moment he stepped back inside, he called the city zoning office, demanding answers. A tired-sounding clerk put him on hold for 10 agonizing minutes before returning with an infuriatingly casual response. "We have no active permits filed for construction at your address." His grip on the phone tightened. "Then why the hell is there a bulldozer ripping up my backyard?" The clerk hesitated before sighing. You'll need to file a formal complaint. We'll review it in due time. I don't have time for bureaucracy. Someone needs to come here today. Sir, we're backed up for weeks. If there's an active dispute, you should try resolving it with your HOA. Mark almost laughed at the absurdity. I am not in the damn HOA. That's the whole problem. But it was useless. The clerk repeated the same scripted response before hanging up. Furious, Mark stormed back outside. The construction hadn't slowed. In fact, it seemed to be ramping up. More workers had arrived, and one was already pouring concrete into the freshly dug foundation. Samantha stood off to the side, speaking with one of the contractors, sipping her overpriced coffee like this was just another day at the office. Mark marched right up to her, voice like steel. "You don't have a permit. The city has no record of this project. That means everything happening here is completely illegal." Samantha barely spared him a glance. "I told you, Mark, the paperwork is in progress. It's just a matter of time." He took another step forward, his patience hanging by a thread. "Then why didn't you wait for approval before starting?" "Oh, wait, I know. Because you knew damn well this wouldn't pass legally." She finally looked at him fully, eyes narrowing. "I don't appreciate your accusations. I suggest you step back and let this happen quietly. It's inevitable. Fighting it will only make things harder for you." Mark clenched his jaw. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a power play. Samantha had already decided she owned his land and assumed that throwing around her influence would make him give up and accept it. But she was wrong. Without another word, he walked straight toward the construction crew. "Everyone stop what you're doing. You're trespassing on private property." A few workers hesitated, looking uncertain. The foreman, a burly man in a dust-covered vest, walked over with a clipboard. "We have a contract with Ms. Reed." Mark folded his arms. "That contract is worthless if it's for stolen land. If you keep working here, I'll make sure every one of you is held liable." Samantha's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Mark, don't be ridiculous. They're just doing their jobs. You're creating unnecessary conflict." He turned on her, eyes blazing. "No, you did that the moment you decided my property was yours to take. This is criminal trespassing. Either they stop or I call the sheriff." Silence fell over the site. The workers exchanged nervous glances. The foreman muttered something under his breath before waving a hand, signaling them to pause. Samantha's face twisted in frustration, but before she could argue, Mark pulled out his phone, dialing the local sheriff's department right in front of her. "Yes, I need officers at my residence immediately. I have trespassers on my property conducting illegal construction." For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Samantha's face. She hadn't expected him to escalate so quickly, but Mark wasn't playing games. This was just the beginning. The sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, their patrol cars rolling up to the property as Mark stood his ground by the construction site. The workers had stopped, but the equipment remained, and Samantha looked far too calm for someone about to be caught red-handed. Deputy Carlson, a stocky man with sharp eyes, stepped out first. "Who called this in?" Mark raised his hand. "I did. These people are trespassing and performing unauthorized construction on my land. I want them removed." Carlson gave a slow nod, then turned to Samantha. "Ma'am, do you have a permit for this project?" Samantha exhaled dramatically as if she were exasperated by the inconvenience. "The paperwork is in process. This is a community project, Deputy. I'm the HOA president, and we're simply making improvements that will benefit everyone. Mr. Holden is, unfortunately, being difficult." Mark scoffed. "She doesn't own this land, and I am not part of her HOA." Carlson tilted his head. "Is that true? Is his property under HOA jurisdiction?" For the first time, Samantha hesitated. It was barely perceptible, but Mark saw it. He could practically hear the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way to manipulate the situation. "Technically, no, but then this is private property." Carlson's voice turned firm. "Without a permit, and without the owner's consent. This is unlawful construction. I'm going to need your crew to leave." The workers exchanged glances, waiting for Samantha's response. For a moment, it seemed like she would comply, but then her expression hardened. "I understand, Deputy. Of course, we'll pause construction. For now. But I do want it on record that Mr. Holden is actively working against community improvements." Mark rolled his eyes. "Spare me the PR spin, Samantha." Carlson didn't look impressed either. He gave Mark a nod before addressing the workers. "Pack it up. If I get another call about this, it won't just be a warning." Samantha's jaw clenched, but she said nothing as the workers begrudgingly began loading their equipment. As the sheriff's deputies pulled away, Mark felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. The next day, Mark followed up with the zoning office, expecting to hear that Samantha's so-called paperwork in progress was nothing but a lie. Instead, he was given an answer that sent a cold chill down his spine. Yes, the permit request was filed yesterday afternoon. It's under expedited review. Mark's stomach twisted. Expedited? Since when does the city fast-track permits? The clerk on the phone sounded nervous, as if they had already been warned that someone would call about this. "We, sometimes make exceptions for community projects." It hit him like a ton of bricks. Samantha had bribed someone. She wasn't backing down. She was playing the long game. She had pulled strings to make sure that the paperwork was processed as quickly as possible. If it was approved before Mark could stop it, she could argue in court that it was legal construction. Fury burned in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I want to file an official challenge against that permit. I have proof that this land does not belong to the HOA and that this project is unauthorized." There was a long pause. Then the clerk's voice came back, robotic and almost rehearsed. "You'll need to submit your request in writing, and it will be reviewed at our next committee meeting. That meeting is scheduled 4 weeks from now." Mark nearly crushed his phone in his hand. 4 weeks. By then, the construction would be finished. He realized what was happening. The city was stalling. Someone in the department was making sure Samantha got her way. This wasn't just about an HOA overstepping its bounds anymore. This was corruption. And if he didn't act fast, he was about to lose everything. Mark refused to let Samantha and her corrupt allies steamroll him. If the city was going to stall, then he needed to hit back, fast and hard. He had already gathered evidence. Photos of the construction, recordings of Samantha admitting she didn't own the land, and now, proof that the permit process was being fast-tracked under suspicious circumstances. But evidence meant nothing if it was buried under red tape. So he called his lawyer, James Porter, an old college friend turned litigation expert. When Mark explained the situation, James didn't hesitate. "They're playing dirty. Fine. Then we make this as public as possible. First thing, file an injunction." "How long will that take?" Mark asked, pacing his living room. "Normally a few weeks, but if we prove imminent damage, we can push for an emergency hearing." That was exactly what they did. James drafted a formal legal challenge against the permit and a motion to halt all construction, arguing that Mark's property rights were being violated. They submitted it the very next morning, forcing the city to acknowledge the dispute. But that wasn't enough. Mark knew that Samantha thrived in the shadows, manipulating systems where no one was watching, so he decided to expose her publicly. Mark took to social media, posting a detailed account of Samantha's land grab along with photos and documents. He didn't just tell his story, he named names, tagging local journalists and city officials. The post went viral overnight, gaining traction as angry homeowners, frustrated with their own HOA experiences, flooded the comments with support. By noon, Mark's phone exploded with messages. One was from a local news station asking for an interview. Another was from a whistleblower in the zoning department who confirmed that Samantha had been bribing officials for years to bend the rules in her favor. Then came the real bombshell. One of Samantha's own HOA board members reached out. "I can't do this anymore," the man admitted over the phone. "She's been running this HOA like a personal dictatorship. She forged signatures to approve this project. Half the board never even saw the proposal. If you take this to court, I'll testify." Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. He had her. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, but Mark knew Samantha wasn't going to wait quietly. She was losing control, and when people like her felt trapped, they lashed out. That night, as Mark was reviewing documents with James, he saw something on his security cameras, a black SUV creeping up his driveway. A bad feeling settled in his gut. Samantha wasn't done fighting, and this time, she was bringing backup. Mark's pulse quickened as he watched the black SUV roll to a stop in his driveway. The headlights stayed on, illuminating his front yard with an eerie glow. He instinctively reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Then, the doors opened. Samantha stepped out first, dressed in her usual power suit, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the late hour. But she wasn't alone. 2 men followed her, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothing. Not HOA board members, not lawyers. Muscle. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had expected pushback, but not this. A knock echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate. He let a few seconds pass before opening the door, making sure the security camera above his porch had a clear view of the visitors. "What do you want, Samantha? You're trespassing." She smiled, but it was cold and razor-sharp. "We need to talk. May we come in?" Mark leaned against the doorframe. "Not a chance. Say whatever it is you need to say and get off my property." One of the men, the larger of the two, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The implied threat was loud and clear. Samantha's smile widened. "Mark, I think we've both taken this too far. Lawsuits, news stories, it's all gotten so messy." She sighed dramatically, tilting her head. "You're a reasonable man. Why don't we put all of this behind us? Drop the injunction, and I'll compensate you for any inconvenience." Mark chuckled, crossing his arms. "You think I'm stupid? You've spent weeks trying to steal my land, and now that you're losing, you want to make peace? No thanks." Her expression darkened. "Don't be stubborn. You really want to go to war with me? I have friends in high places, Mark. You can fight, but in the end, you'll lose." Mark held her gaze, unshaken. "The city's already investigating your bribery. Your own board members are turning against you. You're the one who's going to lose, Samantha." Her nostrils flared. "Think carefully. A drawn-out legal battle could be unpleasant for you. Your life could become very difficult." "Are you threatening me?" She gave a sweet, empty laugh. "Of course not. Just giving you a friendly warning." Mark didn't blink. He slowly raised his phone and turned the screen toward her, showing the live feed from his security camera. Every word of their conversation had been recorded. Samantha's smirk faltered. Mark smiled. "Now, I suggest you and your thugs get back in your car before I call the sheriff." Again. The larger man tensed, his jaw clenching like he wanted to do something about it, but Samantha grabbed his arm. "We're leaving," she snapped. As she turned back to Mark, her expression was pure venom. "You'll regret this." He gave her a lazy wave as the SUV pulled away. Mark locked the door and immediately sent the footage to James, the police, and the news station that had interviewed him earlier. If Samantha thought she could intimidate him into backing down, she had severely underestimated him. The next morning, the news broke. The video spread online like wildfire. The headline read, "HOA president caught threatening homeowner. Over land dispute. Bribery investigation expands." Samantha had played her final card, and now the walls were closing in on her. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as Mark stepped inside, flanked by his lawyer, James Porter. The hearing was supposed to be a straightforward injunction request, a legal attempt to force Samantha to stop construction. But after last night's incident, after the video of her threats had gone viral, the stakes had skyrocketed. Samantha sat at the defendant's table, her posture stiff but composed. She wore a dark blue suit, her makeup immaculate, but there was tension in her jaw, in the way her fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of the table. She was trying to project confidence, but Mark could see the cracks forming. As the judge entered, everyone rose, then settled. The hearing began with James laying out the case clearly and methodically. "Your Honor, this is not just a property dispute. This is an egregious case of trespassing, fraudulent land acquisition, and intimidation. The defendant, Samantha Reed, acting as president of the Coastal Hills HOA, initiated an illegal construction project on my client's property without any legal claim. She has filed fraudulent permit requests, manipulated city officials, and, most importantly, has attempted to threaten and coerce my client into silence." James turned and held up a printed still image from the security footage, displaying Samantha's smug face as she stood with her hired muscle. "This video evidence, Your Honor, proves beyond a doubt that she attempted to intimidate my client into withdrawing his complaint. We are not only requesting an injunction to halt construction, but are also urging the court to take immediate action regarding Ms. Reed's abuse of power and criminal activities." Samantha's lawyer, Howard Briggs, an expensive-looking man with a predatory smile, adjusted his tie and rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a personal vendetta dressed up as a legal case. My client has acted entirely within her rights as an HOA president, and the so-called evidence Mr. Holden has provided is nothing more than a misinterpretation of events. The permit for the project was lawfully submitted and is currently under review. The HOA board approved this initiative with full legal authority." Mark watched as Briggs slid a thick folder across the judge's bench. Furthermore, here are signed statements from several board members affirming that Mr. Holden's land was intended to be incorporated into the community plan years ago. This is merely a bureaucratic oversight that we are now correcting. James calmly picked up the folder, flipping through it, before giving Mark a subtle smirk. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request that these statements be examined closely. My client has already spoken to multiple board members who have confirmed that signatures were forged. That caused a ripple through the courtroom. Samantha's expression didn't change, but Mark saw the way her fingers clenched into a fist. Then, the prosecution called its witness, the very board member who had reached out to Mark. A thin, nervous-looking man named Greg Hansen took the stand. He avoided Samantha's glare as he adjusted his glasses and spoke directly into the microphone. I was told to sign papers, but I didn't actually see the full details. Later, I realized that the approval had been faked. The HOA never formally agreed to this construction. James leaned forward. Mr. Hansen, to clarify, you are saying that Ms. Reed deliberately misrepresented the vote to justify construction? Greg swallowed hard but nodded. Yes. And I wasn't the only one. Others on the board were either coerced or unaware of what they were signing. A stunned silence filled the room. Mark glanced at Samantha. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. Then the judge spoke, his voice stern and final. I have heard enough. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the plaintiff's claims. The court hereby grants the injunction. Construction is to halt immediately. Furthermore, due to the severity of the allegations regarding fraudulent documentation and threats against the plaintiff, I am referring this case for criminal investigation. Samantha's face lost all color. Mark sat back, satisfied. The walls around her were finally collapsing. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of the judge's ruling, Samantha Reed's name was splashed across every local media outlet. The headlines were brutal. HOA president caught in fraud scandal. Illegal land grab. Homeowner fights back and wins. Samantha Reed under criminal investigation for threats and corruption. Mark sat on his porch, scrolling through the reports. The city had immediately revoked the fraudulent permit, and by noon, officials arrived to shut down the construction site permanently. Samantha's once grand vision of a community recreation center was now a half-dug hole in stacks of unused materials, a monument to her arrogance. But the real blow came when law enforcement got involved. The next morning, Mark was woken by a loud knock at his door. It was Detective Alvarez, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She wasted no time. Mr. Holden, we're officially launching a criminal case against Ms. Reed. Mark folded his arms. On what charges? Alvarez pulled out a small notepad. So far, fraud, forgery, trespassing, coercion, and conspiracy to commit unlawful land seizure. But given the financial records we're looking into, there might be additional charges related to HOA embezzlement. Mark raised an eyebrow. Embezzlement? Alvarez nodded. We subpoenaed the HOA's financial records this morning. There are some glaring inconsistencies. It looks like Ms. Reed has been misusing funds for years. Lavish trips, personal renovations, questionable consulting fees. The homeowners who've been paying into the HOA? They've been footing the bill for her lifestyle. Mark exhaled. He had known Samantha was power-hungry, but this was next level. That same evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. With Samantha officially under investigation, the remaining board members voted to remove her as president. But it wasn't just a formality. This was a full-blown uprising. Homeowners, furious at the financial mismanagement, started coming forward with their own horror stories. Families had been fined thousands of dollars for minor violations. Elderly residents had been harassed into selling their homes when they fell behind on HOA fees. Anyone who opposed Samantha had been systematically targeted, including Mark. With mounting pressure, the board had no choice but to completely dissolve the HOA's current leadership. But Samantha's nightmare wasn't over. It happened 2 days later, right in front of the HOA office. Mark had been walking his property when he heard sirens in the distance. Moments later, 2 unmarked police cars and a black SUV pulled up in front of Samantha's house. A few curious neighbors stopped to watch as 2 uniformed officers approached her front door. Samantha stepped outside, still dressed impeccably, as if this was just another board meeting. But her confidence cracked when the officer said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, Samantha Reed, you are under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Click. The sound of handcuffs locking echoed across the street. Neighbors whispered. Some looked satisfied. Some even smiled. Mark watched from a distance as they placed her in the back of the police vehicle. For the first time, she wasn't the one holding the power. She was just another criminal getting exactly what she deserved. Mark stood in his backyard staring at the empty lot where the illegal construction site had once stood. The wreckage of Samantha Reed's fraudulent project had been completely torn down by court order, leaving behind nothing but a scar in the earth. It was fitting, really, a physical reminder of what happens when greed and arrogance go unchecked. News of her arrest had spread like wildfire, and by now, she had officially been charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, forgery, trespassing, and embezzlement. The city's investigation had uncovered even more crimes. She had been skimming money from HOA fees for over 5 years, using the funds to finance lavish vacations, personal home renovations, and luxury purchases. The total amount? Over $600,000 stolen from the homeowner she was supposed to represent. The trial hadn't even started yet, but her reputation was beyond repair. Former allies distanced themselves. The remaining HOA board members scrambled to save face, issuing public statements condemning her actions. But it was too late. The damage was done. For the first time in years, the Coastal Hills community was free. 3 weeks after Samantha's arrest, a new HOA board was elected, this time by a Democratic vote. Gone were the tyrannical rules, the excessive fines, the fear that had once hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. One evening, Mark was sitting on his porch when Greg Hansen, the board member who had testified against Samantha, approached his gate. "Mind if I come up?" Greg asked, looking sheepish. Mark gestured for him to sit. Greg exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I just wanted to say, thanks. You stood up to her when the rest of us were too afraid. If you hadn't fought back, she would have gotten away with all of it." Mark took a sip of his coffee. "I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't about to let her take what wasn't hers." Greg nodded. "Well, the new board," he hesitated, as if unsure how to phrase it. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to work with us. We need people who actually care about the community, not just about power." Mark chuckled. "I moved out here to avoid HOA drama, Greg." Greg smirked. "Fair enough. Just know that you've got allies now. Things are changing." And for once, Mark believed it. A few days later, Mark received an official letter from the city. His stomach tightened as he opened it, half expecting another bureaucratic nightmare. Instead, it was a formal apology. The letter, signed by the mayor's office, acknowledged the corruption in the zoning department and promised reforms to prevent another Samantha Reed situation from ever happening again. Mark laughed to himself. He had never intended to start a movement. He just wanted to protect his land. But somehow, standing up to Samantha had set off a chain reaction, one that had exposed corruption, freed an entire community, and held a tyrant accountable. That weekend, Mark hosted a neighborhood barbecue, something that had never happened under Samantha's rule. Families gathered, kids played, and for the first time since moving here, Mark felt like he was truly part of the community. As he stood by the grill, flipping burgers, Greg raised a beer in his direction. "To Mark Holden, the guy who took on the HOA and won." The crowd cheered. Mark shook his head with a grin. "Let's just say I was too damn stubborn to lose." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the peaceful neighborhood, Mark leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. Finally, peace. And this time, it was here to stay.